Alright, this is going to be our first video for Unit 13, the last APUSH unit. It's going to cover everything from Reagan, 1980s until present. I'm going to try to stick as close to scripting this as possible so we can make sure we get done in time, because there's still a good bit to cover, and we don't want to run over time as much as possible. So we're going to cover each part of this unit by president. So we're going to go in order from Reagan onward. Alright, so Ronald Reagan, 1981 to 1989. The election of 1980 is a very important one because it sees the realization of the conservative movement that's been brewing since the 60s and 70s. Policies of Nixon and Ford in the 70s gave politics a steady shift to the right. By 1980, a loose coalition of economic and political conservatives, religious fundamentalists, and political action committees, or PACs as they're known, because now you hear things like super PACs. This is where they start back in the 70s and 80s, called PACs. They formed to make this movement for change called the rise of conservatism. And this is a big movement in American history. In fact, the AP test, this DBQ a few years ago, dealt with the rise of conservatism in the 1980s and 70s. They opposed big government, New Deal liberalism, so they opposed the changes the government's made since the 30s into the 60s and so on. They're for gun control. They're against gun control. They're against feminism, against gay rights, welfare, affirmative action, sexual permissiveness, abortion, and drug use. They believe all these things undermine family and religious values, work ethic, I'm trying to get myself centered here, and national security. The most famous group to do this was called the Moral Majority, or Religious Right, led by a pastor named Jerry Falwell. Moral Majority or Religious Right, same thing. It's basically the extreme conservative religious groups that formed in the 1970s. This is a coalition of mostly Protestant white Southerners who protest a lot of the liberal changes the government's made in the past several years, including even the changes to traditional marriage and change to traditional gender roles. They opposed those kind of change. They fought to unseat liberals, wanted prayer back in school, and wanted Roe v. Wade overturned. And as you can probably tell, this religious right movement is still kind of felt today, currently, because their ideas are still very prevalent in today's politics. But they were organized enough to where they actually could get money raised to try to force congressmen that they didn't care for unseated and changed over. Alright, the campaign of 1980. Former actor and California Governor Ronald Reagan was popular with conservatives and seen as a most effective spokesperson. He was liked, he was sensible, and he was a master of media. He had actually challenged Ford back in '76 for the nomination of the Republican Party, but lost out. President Carter was hurt by a Democrat running against him, Ted Kennedy, one of the Kennedy brothers, and so that hurt his own nomination as well too. Reagan attacked Carter on the hostage crisis, high inflation, and the famous slogan, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" which most Americans agree they were not because the recession had not gone away. Reagan took key New Deal coalition voters away from the Democrats, and Reagan ended up winning with 50% of blue-collar voters in 1980, and those guys becoming known as the Reagan Democrats as a result. 1980 ended the half-century of the Democratic dominance of national politics since FDR and the New Deal. Okay, that's a little better. Alright. The Reagan Revolution. Iranians released hostages on day one. Reagan would soon survived an assassination attempt a few weeks later. He pledged to lower taxes, reduce welfare spending, and build up military and make the federal courts more conservative again, in hopes of overturning things like Roe v. Wade, which are very unpopular. So the very first thing we're going to discuss is Reaganomics, his very famous supply-side economics, who even his future vice president, George H.W. Bush, opposed during the primary season. For supply-side economics, Reagan argued that tax cuts would reduce government spending, would increase private sector spending, and lead to increased production and jobs and prosperity. This was like the antithesis to Keynesian economics. This is very anti-Keynesian economics. Critics of Reaganomics said this was basically trickle-down economics again, like it was back in the 1920s. but it did seem to have at least some prosperity in the 1980s as a result, even though there were a lot of people critical of the idea. People also said it would only help the wealthy, which was pretty much true. The government did cut income, corporate taxes, as well as capital gains and gift taxes. So it was a major sweeping tax cuts that took place throughout Reaganomics, cutting income taxes, corporate income taxes, capital gains, and gift taxes. Also inheritance taxes, too. The biggest relief, though, from all these tax cuts helped out the upper classes because their tax rates went really low. Republicans also cut $40 billion in domestic programs like food stamps, student loans, and mass transportation. So the idea was that you cut taxes majorly to help the government become smaller, hence the idea of conservative government, and you make the government able to do less in terms of welfare programs by cutting all of spending because you don't have as much taxes. So they cut money to food stamps, student loans, and mass transportation. But the savings were offset by massive defense spending. This is where a lot of people, don't talk about Reagan in the sense of being not really conservative, is that he wanted to make a massive military budget, and he actually put us deeper in debt with the massive military spending. So yeah, he was conservative in a lot of other areas, but when it came to military, he actually greatly increased the amount of spending they were doing in the Defense Department. Excuse me. Okay, so that was the Reaganomics, the big plan. We're going to talk about the results here in a minute. Let's go over other issues that happened under the Reagan Revolution, including economics. Next is deregulation. So Reagan wanted to reduce federal regulations on businesses and industry. Restrictions eased on savings and loan institutions, which were a type of bank, mergers, and takeovers. So it was easier for some banks to get away with more types of business dealings. Mergers and institutions could be taken over and merged a lot easier, and a lot of environmental protections were also removed too. Regulations on auto emissions and automobile safety also were reduced to help automakers in the country. So those were reduced to help the manufacturers, but of course at the cost of safety and at the cost of pollution at the same time. He also tried to increase the coal and timber production of federal land to help create more jobs too, which of course at the expense of the environment. So he was for big time deregulation. This also saw the beginning of the end of the labor unions, or at least their big decline. Reagan, even though at one point he was part of a union, was very tough on unions in the 80s. He fired thousands of striking federal air traffic controllers, famously, for violating their contracts. Other businesses kind of took that lead and began to hire more strike replacement workers as a result. Reagan began to have much more anti-union policies as each year progressed, and that resulted in a lot of loss of manufacturing jobs for a lot of unions. So membership greatly decreases from the 80s into the 90s in union membership. It goes down from 30% membership of workers down to 12% by the 90s. So his anti-union policies were very detrimental to the blue-collar working class as time goes on. The recovery. By 1980, economic recovery. By 1980, banks had failed. Unemployment was at 11%. This was all the issues that we saw throughout the 70s. Inflation came down with the fall in 80s oil prices and the recession. Reaganomics began to help the recovery begin by 1983. So it was a few years before Reaganomics really took a hold. People a lot were beginning to doubt Reagan in the early 80s. But after about 2 or 3 years, the Reaganomics began to take effect. But it widened the income gap. So while the economy began to recover by 83, the income gap widened. Upper classes and what were called yuppies, young urban professionals, enjoyed higher incomes and benefits. The middle class remained stagnant in the 1980s as a result. Social issues. Reagan appointed 3 conservative justices and made William Rehnquist the new Chief Justice, which made the court more conservative. So he moved over one of the justices to make, after Berger was gone, to make the court more led by more conservative, and he appointed 3 conservative justices as well in his time in office. He appointed the first female justice of the Supreme Court, was Sandra Day O'Connor. This court helped to scale back affirmative action in hiring and promotions, and they also limited Roe v. Wade by allowing states to make restrictions. All this led to people really liking Reagan by 1984. In the 1984 election, because of the return of economic prosperity, restored confidence in Reagan administration, and it led to Reagan sweeping in the 1980 election, winning all but one state. The Democrats picked former Vice President Walter Mondale, who was Jimmy Carter's VP. Reagan won 49 states, all except Minnesota. 2/3 of white males voted for Reagan. Only African Americans and the people that made less than $12,000 a year voted for Democrats. So even though the economy was mostly being helped out for the upper classes, most Americans did like Reagan, what he created. We're going to look at the budget and trade deficits next. Reagan's tax cuts combined with large increases in military spending created large deficits. I'll say that again. Reagan's tax cuts combined with large increases in military spending created large deficits. This is where large deficits become more normal like they are now, currently in 2017. The national debt tripled under Reagan from $900 billion with a B to $2.7 trillion. Tax cuts also led to increased consumption, especially of foreign-made luxury and consumer items. The trade imbalance led to a dramatic increase in foreign ownership of U.S. real estate and industry, rather than only American investments. By 1985, the U.S. was a debtor nation for the first time since World War I. So this is where, because of the massive defense spending that Reagan does in the 1980s, and we're going to come back to that later with foreign policy, it makes us a much larger debtor nation, and we haven't really stopped being that since the 1980s, which, like we said, is much more common now. And then lastly, we had the impact of Reaganomics. So he reduced restrictions on free market economy and left more money in hands of investors and higher income Americans. He also continued the growth of the New Deal. He also contained the growth of the New Deal Great Society welfare state that had been developed since the 30s and 60s. But he also left huge deficits behind, which made Democrats and Republicans unlikely to propose new welfare programs like universal health care. So this is a big shift in American thinking in terms of domestic policy, because now, since the 80s, our goals are basically how can we make the government smaller and cut more programs than actually how to expand them. This is why universal health care is still very controversial and never really been passed. But Reagan, conservatives, couldn't get rid of programs like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid due to the popularity of voters. So even though people can criticize them, people don't want to get rid of programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, even though they're huge drains on our economy. Reaganomics also changed the debate from what new government programs are needed to what government programs could be cut and by how much. So that's going to end video 1 with Reagan. We'll resume the next one